ado, I would give the floor to Karsten, who is presenting on his paper with Engelbert Stockhammer, Growing Differently, Financial Cycles, Austerity, and Competitiveness in Growth Models Since the Global Financial Crisis. The floor is yours.
All right. Thanks, Franz. Many thanks for the invitation. It's great to see some familiar faces and names from my times at HWR, and I obviously would love to be in Berlin and have drinks with you later, but maybe another time this year. Okay, so yeah, our paper is called Growing Differently, Financial Cycles, Austerity, and Competitiveness in Growth Models Since the Global Financial Crisis. And we're trying to contribute to the growth models debate in comparative political economy in this paper. So yeah, I'm sure you are all aware of this interesting development that has been going on in comparative political economy. The field was long dominated by the varieties of capitalism approach, which has a focus on static institutional equilibria. And now there has been a change going on towards more demand-driven growth models based on the contributions by Vaccaro and Ponteson and Schwartz, Trenoy, and others who have made efforts to integrate some of the post-Keynesian debates into comparative political economy. Now, if you look at the literature on growth models, it appears that there's two growth models that are particularly prominent in this literature. The first one is the stereotypical export-led growth model. Germany, I guess this is one of the main examples here. And then the second one, we have the debt-financed consumption-led growth model, for example, in the UK. We have the impression that these two growth models became so prominent because they were very apt in capturing the boom that was going on prior to the 2008 global financial crisis. And if you look at the one of the common methods that has been used in the growth models literature to identify those growth models, you will find that this has been often done through decompositions of GDP growth into consumption, investment, government expenditures, and net exports. And then obviously in the export-led growth model, net exports play a big role in those GDP decompositions. And in the consumption-led growth models, it's obviously the consumption growth that is the main driver of economic growth. Now, what do we do in our paper? How do we engage with this literature? So we make an argument that this export-led versus consumption-led growth model dichotomy, as identified via the growth contributions, has some weaknesses. One argument that we make is that this approach, especially when using the growth contributions, may misinterpret growth drivers in a financial downturn. I'll explain in more detail how that plays out in detail. But we argue that the growth contributions can lead to misleading results when you have strong cyclical dynamics going on, which we experienced with in the context of the global financial crisis. We also fear that the literature is a bit too restrictive in the assumed growth drivers that it analyzes and assumptions about their stability. So in the literature, you have a strong focus on real wage growth as a driver, sometimes of consumption demand, or competitiveness as a driver of export demand. But we feel that the number of growth drivers that are being considered is relatively narrow, and there's often the assumption that these growth drivers are fairly stable, and then that we can identify stable growth models based on those growth drivers. And so we argue that the 2008 global financial crisis has changed things quite substantially, such that this distinction between export-led versus consumption-led growth models has lost some of its usefulness. And we offer the notion of growth drivers to help make sense of some of these dynamics that we observe. So we argue that growth drivers are factors that cause changes in the components of aggregate income growth. And in that sense, they're different from growth contributions, which just show you which of the components of GDP growth have been most dynamic. The growth drivers instead look at causal factors that potentially are behind changing dynamics in the growth components. And we then aim to broaden the consideration of growth drivers and how they were affected by the global financial crisis. And we essentially focus on three issues. We focus on financial cycles as a source of private demand. We look at fiscal spending as a source of public demand. And we look at competitiveness, on different dimensions of competitiveness, as a source of foreign demand. In terms of the empirical analysis, as I just said, we look at those growth drivers and how they have changed in response to the global financial crisis. And here we look at 30 OECD countries, and we distinguish a pre-crisis period from 2000 to 2007 from a post-crisis period from 2008 to 2017. We look at several proxies for private demand, house prices and household debt mostly, because we're interested in financial drivers of private demand. Secondly, we look at proxies for public demand. Here we look at the structural fiscal balance. And thirdly, we look at a proxy for foreign demand, the real effective exchange rate as a measure of price competitiveness, and the export complexity index as a measure of non-price competitiveness. And I want to be upfront about this. So our empirical approach is relatively simple. We just look at scatter plots between GNI growth and those putative growth drivers for both subperiods. The advantage of those scatter plots is that we can look at whether there have been changes between the two periods. And since it's a scatter plot, we can also see it, where are the countries in the space, and this is useful for comparative analysis. We also do a simple multivariate regression, but overall our empirical approach is deliberately simple. Okay, let me start by making a couple of points on where we see shortcomings in some of the recent comparative political economy analysis and how we aim to contribute with our empirical analysis. So as I said before, there has been this welcome shift within comparative political economy towards more demand-side oriented analyses, particularly in the contribution by Baccaro and Pontusson. However, as I said, in this literature, there's still a relatively narrow focus on real wages on the one hand, and sometimes debt as well as drivers of consumption demand, and on price competitiveness as a driver of export demand. So there has been relatively little concern in this paper, at least, for cyclical financial dynamics, which we believe are important in the context of the global financial crisis. Relatively little concern also for fiscal policy, which is actually quite interesting, because I think many scholars, I think, in this debate would probably relatively easily agree that fiscal policy is important. But there has been relatively little attention to fiscal policy in this part of the debate. And there's also relatively little concern for non-price competitiveness. So I'll say a bit more about that later on. Now, there's a very recent paper by Eckert and co-authors in the Review of International Political Economy, which also contributes to this growth models debate in comparative political economy. And what they do is they utilize the growth contributions to classify growth models, but they combine that with the sectoral balances of the public sector, the private sector, and the foreign sector. In that way, they bring in a slightly more attention to finance through those sectoral balances and also to public demand. And in that way, I think they do overcome some of the limitations in the earlier contributions to the growth models debate. They certainly broaden the analysis. But one of the issues we see in the use of the growth contributions is that these growth contributions can yield questionable results, especially when you look at the post-crisis period. So, in the paper by Eckert in RIPE, for instance, 24 out of the 30 countries in the paper are classified as export-led after the global financial crisis due to a strong improvement in current accounts that you observe in that period. So for instance, the GFC countries, so Greece, Ireland, Italy, Portugal, and Spain are all classified as, I think, weakly export-led in the post-crisis period. And in our view, this illustrates some of the pitfalls of the use of growth contributions, because the growth contributions don't tell us much about sort of what are the underlying changes in growth drivers that may have led to changes in the growth contributions. And so, for instance, cyclical changes in house prices or some of the financial variables you don't see in the growth contributions, but they can lead to changes in the composition of aggregate demand. And that may sometimes then give you the impression there was a change towards export-led growth, but it can be questionable whether that's a useful interpretation of the post-crisis period. Okay, let me illustrate this point very briefly. So here we have some macroeconomic indicators for our 30 countries. But you can focus here on the last column, the fourth column, which is the current account to GNI ratio. And here we have the 2000 to 2007 period, and then the 2008 to 2017 period. And all of the cells here that have the gray shading, they illustrate that the current account has improved in the post-crisis period compared to the pre-crisis period. So you can see that for the majority of countries here in our sample, yes, we see an improvement in the current account position in the post-crisis period compared to the pre-crisis period. Here, I'm zooming in an element of that big table, and you can focus here on the lower, the last couple of rows here, where we have France, Greece, Italy, Portugal, and Spain. So we have Southern Europe here. And we also do a growth decomposition here into the growth contribution of the current account and of the domestic income on the other hand, so in the columns 2 and 3. And you can see here, if you focus on the second column for those Southern European countries, that we have a much stronger positive growth contribution of the current account in the post-crisis period. So overall, we have more than 2/3 of countries that improve their current account balance. Many countries switched from a negative current account growth contribution to a positive one. So one might get the impression that there was some sort of generalization of the export-led model going on in the post-crisis period. But as I said, there is some issues with the use of the growth contributions here, because if you consider a country like Spain, where you had a house price bubble going on, arguably, prior to the global financial crisis that then burst with the crisis. So you have deleveraging going on, household deleveraging after the crisis, which is in a way exacerbated through austerity policies. So you see a decline in domestic demand, and that slows down import demand, leads to an improvement in the current account position. And you may conclude that Spain has turned towards a weakly export-led growth model, but it's a bit questionable whether that's an apt categorization of what's going on there. So what we do here to disentangle that is we decompose the current account growth contribution into exports and imports. And then we ask the question, was the change in the growth contribution of exports larger than the change in the growth contribution of imports? And you can see, this is what we report here in the last column of the table. And you can see that for almost all countries in the sample except Ireland, the answer is no. So most countries didn't, the improvement in the current account growth contribution for most countries did not come through a significant acceleration of export growth, but rather to a slowdown in the growth rate of imports. And this is also, of course, here the case for the Southern European countries that are highlighted as an example. Interesting cases are actually Greece and Spain, which are extreme cases in a way where this import growth contribution is even positive. So they really violently reduce the import demand, and that is one of the main reasons how they improve their current account growth contribution in the post-crisis period. Okay, so this analysis that I presented suggests a slightly different picture and illustrates that a decomposition into exports and imports is useful here, and suggests that the improvement in current accounts of the formerly consumption-led or export or debt-led growth models is mostly due to slower import growth. And so in that sense, the growth contributions can give some spurious results here for the post-crisis period. Okay, but sort of this is a relatively specific point here. The broader conclusion that we want to draw from this is that we believe it's important to think a bit more about those growth drivers as opposed to the growth contributions only, because the growth contributions have limited information, and the growth drivers, which are potential causal factors that can cause changes in the private, public, or foreign demand, are likely to be a bit more informative about what has been going on. And one of the important things is here as well, when you look at growth drivers, is that we can pay more attention in a way to cyclical changes in those growth drivers, or how growth drivers change in response to a global crisis, such as the global financial crisis. And so let me get a bit more specific here about the types of growth drivers that we have in mind. So we have here first house prices as a potentially strong driver of private demand via wealth effects and residential construction as well. And we link the analysis of house prices as a growth driver to the notion of Minskian financial cycles. So we argue that house prices have a strong endogenous cyclical property that in a way makes sustained economic growth through house price increases unlikely. So we would expect a growth model that is strongly driven on increasing house prices to exhibit cyclical dynamics. So at some point, the growth model is going to change its nature in a way, and going to switch from a boom to a bust. Secondly, we look at fiscal spending. And here we argue that, again, where we are in the cycle matters, because there is a literature that argues that fiscal multipliers become larger in recessions. And in that sense, fiscal policy is likely to have become more important after the global financial crisis, where it made a big difference whether countries engaged in fiscal expansion or in austerity. Finally, we also look at the distinction between price and non-price competitiveness. As I said, lots of the comparative political economy literature has focused on price competitiveness and has argued, the Southern European countries, for instance, they lost their price competitiveness because they had strong wage inflation. So from that perspective, you may expect wage suppression after the crisis to support economic growth in those countries. And this is something we want to analyze as well. And we juxtapose this notion of price competitiveness with the concept of non-price competitiveness, which has been highlighted in some of the structuralist post-Keynesian literature that argues that it's more the technological upgrading and export complexity that is important for export demand. Okay, so let me go into our empirical analysis of growth drivers. So as I said, we look at scatter plots for those growth drivers for the two time periods that we compare, the pre-crisis period and the post-crisis period. So here in the upper panel, you have a scatter plot of GNI growth against real house price growth for the pre-crisis and the post-crisis period. And you can see that we have a positive relationship here between house price growth and GNI growth. So that is consistent with the idea of house prices as a driver of aggregate demand. And we also see here in the lower panel the link between house price growth and changes in household debt. And again, we see a positive relationship, which means that episodes of strong house price growth not only come with GDP growth, but they also come with higher household debt. And this is important because this helps understand why there's a certain cyclical tendency in house prices as a growth driver. So because these booms in house prices come with increases in household debt, in a way, the house price driven boom sows the seed for the bust, if you like, because as the boom goes on, financial fragility worsens. And we see this here in this scatter plot, which plots the change in household debt before the crisis against the change in household debt after the crisis. And we see that countries such as Ireland, which are in a way the extreme case here at the bottom right of the chart, they underwent a strong increase in household debt before the crisis. And they're also the ones that deleveraged the most after the crisis. And so in our view, that is consistent with the notion of a mean scale financial cycle. And it illustrates the cyclical nature of growth models that strongly rely on finance as a driver of private demand. And it also illustrates that these growth models are likely to undergo drastic changes every once in a while when they switch from a boom to a bust. And this is precisely what we see in the period after the global financial crisis, where most of these regimes switch towards a bust. Okay, now we bring in fiscal policy as a driver of public demand, a direct source of public demand. And we use here the cyclically adjusted fiscal balance. So this is a measure that tries to isolate the more discretionary components of fiscal spending that is not sensitive to the business cycle as such. And you see here in the pre-crisis period a negative relationship with economic growth. So tighter fiscal stance, lower economic growth. This is what we would expect from a Keynesian perspective. But what you also see is that when you then compare that with the post-crisis period, that the link becomes tighter. So the countries are clustered closer to the fitted line, and the slope coefficient becomes statistically significant. So in our view, that supports the idea that we have these regime-dependent fiscal multipliers that become stronger in the recession, and that partly explains why fiscal policy became more important in the post-crisis period. Okay, finally, we look at competitiveness as a source of export demand. And as I said, we distinguish price competitiveness from non-price competitiveness. And so here we use the real effective exchange rate based on unit labor cost in manufacturing as a measure for price competitiveness. And we see that in both periods, we have an unexpected positive link with growth. So you appreciate your real exchange rate. So in a way, you lose price competitiveness, and still you have a positive relationship with economic growth here. So there's no strong evidence here for relevance of price competitiveness for economic growth. Now we do the same exercise with a measure of economic complexity. So we use the economic complexity index, and we see here a change going on between the two periods. So we had a negative relationship before the crisis, which is a bit unexpected because it means that countries that had a higher economic complexity score had lower economic growth rates. But then in the post-crisis period, we get a positive link. Now you can see the link isn't very strong. The line is basically flat, which has a lot to do with the two countries here at the top left, Australia and New Zealand, which in a way mess up the entire relationship. So if you exclude those countries that arguably are a bit different because they are close to China, you get a very strong positive relationship. We do a further exercise where we plot those two competitive measures against the current account, and there we get even stronger results. So we have no relationship here between wage deflation and better current account positions. So there's no evidence that wage deflation improved current accounts, but we have a very strong positive relationship here between export sophistication and the current account performance in the post-crisis period. Okay, we also do a multivariate regression, but I realize that I'm running out of time, so I'm gonna skip that and try to wrap up. Overall, we find a strong link between property prices and growth, and we also find evidence of this financial cycle, which took the form of contractionary deleveraging after the global financial crisis. Secondly, we find that expansionary fiscal policy is associated with higher growth, and that aggressive fiscal consolidation after the crisis reduced growth. Finally, we only find limited evidence for wage suppression as a source of growth. And if anything, there's some evidence that export sophistication may have become more important as a driver of growth in the post-crisis period. Okay, so a couple of takeaways from this analysis for the growth models debate. First, we want to hammer the point that the debt finance growth model is cyclical. Financial booms come with debt-driven stagnation, and we try to bring in the idea of Minsky and financial cycles into the growth models literature, which we feel hasn't received so much attention before. Secondly, we also highlight the critical role of the fiscal policy response to the global financial crisis, and that it made a big difference whether countries engaged in expansion or austerity. And we link this to the Keynesian idea of state-dependent fiscal multipliers. And finally, we argue that some of the CPE literature has overstated the relevance of price competitiveness a little bit, which is evidenced by the fact that internal devaluation after the crisis didn't really boost growth. And possibly there's a greater role here for the structuralist literature that highlights technological upgrading and export complexity. Okay, so the bigger picture here is that those growth drivers can indeed change over time. And this means that some of the growth models tend to be unstable. And in the particular time period that we're analyzing, this has the effect that this dichotomy of export-led versus consumption-led growth models has lost some of its usefulness, because we believe that these growth models aren't really export-led, or the term is a bit misleading because export doesn't seem to be a main driver of growth anymore. So we rather think about the post-crisis period as an interregnum that is characterized by the breakdown of those pre-crisis growth models. Okay, I'll stop here and I look forward to your comments and questions.